The single 105mm howitzer, its crew, and the ammunition to feed it could not walk into the jungle. That simple fact shaped how the United States fought much of its war in Vietnam. The enemy moved on foot through terrain that swallowed roads and vehicles, and American commanders needed a way to put artillery within reach of infantry, no matter where those patrols wandered. Their answer was to lift the guns by helicopter onto ground hacked from the jungle and leave them there, garrisoned and defended as long as the fighting required. These were the fire support bases, and for the men assigned to them, the firebase was not a battlefield they visited, but a place they lived, sometimes for months. This is the story of what that life demanded, day after day. It is a story less about battles than about endurance, about what happens when a strategy built around firepower collides with heat, disease, exhaustion, and the patient pressure of an enemy who chose the time and place of every fight. The fire support base was a deliberate answer to a specific problem. The enemy refused to hold ground, moved through jungle and mountains that swallowed conventional units, and could concentrate and disperse faster than large formations could respond. The solution planners settled on was mobility anchored by firepower. Infantry moved through the countryside on search and destroy operations, and wherever they operated, they needed artillery within range. The answer was to hack temporary artillery positions out of the jungle itself, blasting clearings from the dense growth and connecting them by helicopter to the larger network. A patch of jungle that took a rifle company hours to reach on foot could become an operating artillery position within a day. Some bases sat on high ground where a hilltop offered fields of fire and natural defense, but most were carved into the low, flat jungle where the infantry actually operated, ringed on every side by walls of vegetation. A battery of 6 105mm howitzers could reach out roughly 7 miles in any direction. Position enough of them across a province, and in theory no infantry patrol would ever be beyond the reach of supporting fire. The trouble was that a firebase once built could not simply pick up and leave when the fighting shifted. It had to be garrisoned, supplied, and defended, and the men who did that work inherited every hardship the terrain and climate could produce. Consider what one of these positions actually looked like. Engineers with bulldozers and demolition charges tore an opening in the jungle, dropping trees and scraping the ground bare until a raw circle of red earth stood surrounded by a wall of green. On low ground, the jungle pressed right up to the wire, close enough in places that a man on the perimeter could not see 50 yards into it. Where the terrain allowed, a base might instead crown a hilltop, trading the claustrophobia of the tree line for open fields of fire. At the center sat the artillery, arranged to fire in any direction, with the fire direction center, ammunition bunkers, a command post, and a landing zone. Ringing it all was the defensive perimeter, a belt of bunkers, fighting positions, barbed wire, trip flares, and claymore mines, often several bands deep, held by an infantry company or two pulled off patrol for security. Some bases held a single battery. Others grew into sprawling installations with hundreds of men. What they shared was exposure. A firebase was a fixed, visible, known point in hostile territory, and everyone on both sides knew exactly where it was. The men who filled these positions came from the artillery and the infantry, and their work diverged sharply. The gun crews worked the howitzers, and the labor was brutal. A single 105mm round weighed over 40 pounds, and during a fire mission, a crew might move dozens of them in minutes, in heat past 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The guns fired at all hours. A patrol in contact miles away might call for support at 3 in the morning, and the crews would roll out of what sleep they had and begin sending shells downrange. The infantry on the perimeter carried a different burden: to watch, to wait, to walk the patrols that pushed out each day, and to be ready when the attack came. Both groups shared the same food, the same mud, and the same sense of living inside a target. The photographs that survive tell a revealing story about how safe the men felt from day to day. In many of them, the troops wear no flak jackets and no helmets at all, working the guns and lounging in bare torsos or light t-shirts under the sun. The relaxed dress is itself evidence. For long stretches, in daylight, a firebase was a relatively safe place, and the men knew it and lived accordingly. That ease reversed the moment they crossed the wire on a patrol, or the moment the base came under fire, when the same men would dress for war and lie low in their bunkers, sometimes for days on end if the position was under close siege. Firebase life ran between these two states, the sunbathing calm and a sudden scramble for cover, and part of what wore the men down was never knowing which the next hour would bring. The physical environment was the first enemy, and it never rested. Vietnam was often brutally hot and humid, and with no air conditioning anywhere in the fieldworks, the heat sat on the men constantly, soaking uniforms within minutes of dawn. In the dry season, the cleared earth turned to fine red dust that worked into weapons, food, and lungs, and turned every helicopter landing into a blinding storm. Then the monsoon reversed the problem. The same red earth became a deep, sucking mud that pulled boots off feet and filled fighting positions with standing water. Rain could turn a man's personal hole into a mud bath, or the whole firebase into a shallow lake. It washed away the semi-permanent constructions that held the place together and drove the vegetation to grow back at an uncontrollable rate, so both had to be fought at once by work parties who never quite got ahead. Bunkers flooded, men lived and slept in wet clothing for weeks, and the rain grounded the helicopters that were the firebase's only lifeline, cutting off resupply until the weather broke. Apart from the heat and the endless trouble with food and water, there was always the local wildlife. The insects were relentless and, in a real sense, dangerous. Mosquitoes carried malaria, which put more American soldiers out of action in some periods than enemy fire did, and men took their weekly pills, or were supposed to, and still the disease moved through units in the worst areas. Lice, leeches, and flies were a daily fact, and fire ants, centipedes, and scorpions shared the bunkers, along with rats bold enough to bite sleeping soldiers. Snakes were a genuine hazard, and so in some places were far larger predators. Tigers killed and injured several men over the course of the war, including at least one fatality around Fire Support Base Alpine in Quang Tri Province. Not every danger was even local. On one occasion, a field kitchen was bombed by a helicopter delivering Thanksgiving turkeys that had not yet been defrosted. This is the part of the war that rarely appears in the histories because it produced no battles and won no ground. Yet disease and non-battle injury accounted for a staggering share of the casualties in Vietnam, much of it collected quietly, one fever and one infection at a time. Food and water were constant preoccupations because both had to be flown in, and neither was ever quite enough. For long stretches, the men ate sea rations, canned meals designed for durability rather than pleasure, heated over a stove improvised from a ration can. Hot food from a central kitchen was the exception, and even the largest bases could be rough. At the sprawling position nicknamed the Golf Course in 1965, the commander, Harold Moore, later summed it up bluntly: pup tents, sea rations, and showers only when it rained. He did at least insist his men shave every day, one act of discipline held against the general squalor. Water was the harder problem. In that heat, a soldier needed gallons a day simply to function, and all of it had to be flown up in rubber bladders and cans, or purified from local sources with iodine tablets that left it tasting of chemicals. Thirst was a normal condition, and so was the low-grade misery of dehydration. Sleep, when it came in fragments. The firebase never fully rested, because half its strength had to be awake and watching at any given hour. Men pulled guard duty in the bunkers through the night, straining against the dark, aware that the enemy preferred these hours. By day there were patrols to walk, positions to improve, sandbags to fill, and the endless labor of maintaining a place the climate was constantly trying to reclaim. Fatigue accumulated across days and weeks until it became a permanent background state that slowed reactions and wore down judgment. Commanders understood the danger, but the arithmetic of the perimeter left little room to fix it. There were only so many men, and the perimeter had to be watched every minute of every day. Hygiene collapsed to the barest minimum. Bathing meant a helmet full of cold water, if water could be spared, or nothing at all for days. Uniforms rotted in the wet, feet trapped in wet boots, developed immersion injuries and fungal infections that thrived in the climate. Latrines were primitive, often little more than a slit trench, and the standard method of disposal was as crude as it was memorable. Human waste collected in the cut-down base of a 55-gallon drum, doused in diesel and set alight. A chore that sent a black, reeking smoke drifting across the position. Comforts were absent. Very few bases smaller than the great installation at Kaysai had anything like shower blocks, beer halls, or officers' clubs. Small cuts turned into festering sores that would not heal, and the jungle rot, as the men called the skin ailments that afflicted almost everyone, was near universal. All of it was simply endured, because there was no alternative. One impression comes through powerfully in every surviving photograph. A firebase was not a pretty place to live. The whole position was churned into mud or blanketed in dust when the weather turned dry, because so many men and vehicles were packed into a small space. Unlike the enemy, who hid everything, the Americans made no attempt to camouflage the position or conceal the debris, and the soldiers' universal habit of leaving litter reached new heights. Nothing resembling an aesthetic went into firebase architecture. The result was a shantytown thrown together from whatever was at hand, tents and mud holes beside grander structures that might be little more than a few neat layers of sandbags, with new building always underway somewhere, so the shape of the place shifted day to day. Living rough like this grinds on people who are not used to it, and most of these men were not. They were draftees lifted straight out of the comforts of American cities and set down in the jungle, in an environment and a military discipline both deeply alien to them, and the squalor was one more thing to reconcile. Isolation shaped the psychology of the place as much as any physical hardship. A firebase might sit miles from the nearest friendly position, connected to the rest of the war only by radio and by the helicopters that came and went with the weather. The perimeter marked the edge of the American world. Beyond the last strand of wire, the countryside belonged to someone else after dark. That sense of being a small, watched island in hostile territory pressed on the men constantly, the ground from which every other fear grew. The threat took several forms. The most common was indirect fire. The enemy favored mortars and rockets, weapons that could be carried through the jungle, set up quickly, fired, and abandoned before American counter-battery fire could respond. The firebase was an ideal target, a fixed position of known location packed with men and ammunition. A barrage could come at any hour, most often at night, while the men pressed themselves into their bunkers. These attacks rarely destroyed a base, but they killed and wounded steadily, and their unpredictability was itself a weapon. A man could be killed crossing the open ground to the latrine as easily as in a firefight. The randomness wore on the nerves in a way that direct combat, for all its terror, sometimes did not. Then there were the ground assaults, the attacks the entire firebase existed to survive. These almost always came at night, and they opened not with a roar, but with silence. The first move belonged to the sappers, specially trained assault engineers who crawled up to the wire and began cutting it, patiently deactivating the claymores and trip flares as they went. With luck, they stayed undetected until a savage bombardment of mortars and rockets crashed down on the center of the base, and that barrage was itself the signal for the mass assault, sometimes a battalion, sometimes a whole regiment driving for the gaps behind satchel charges. Rocket-propelled grenades and hand grenades meant to blow apart the bunkers. For the defenders, the first priority was to turn night into day, hanging the sky with parachute flares, because a firebase could only bring its firepower to bear on attackers it could see. These were the moments the base had been built to withstand, and they tested everything. The bunkers, the discipline of the gun crews, the interlocking fields of fire, and the nerve of men woken from exhausted sleep into a world of noise and light and flying steel. Patrolling was the other constant, the work that pushed the war outward from the perimeter. Infantry companies rotated out to disrupt enemy movement, to find the mortar and rocket positions before they could be used, and to keep the enemy from massing undetected close to the base. It was dangerous, exhausting work that produced a steady trickle of casualties from mines, booby traps, and ambushes. The men carried everything they needed on their backs through terrain that resisted every step, knowing any footfall might trigger a device that would take a leg or a life. The patrols were essential to the firebase's survival, and they extracted their price in a currency the war spent freely. Young men wounded and killed a few hundred yards from a position that offered no real safety either. Injuries came from every direction and rarely announced themselves in advance. A mortar round, a command-detonated mine, an accident with the ammunition, a firefight in the wire. When a man was hit, his survival often depended on the helicopter. The dust-offs flew into positions under fire to lift out the wounded with a speed that saved thousands of lives, and a soldier badly hurt in the morning might be on an operating table within the hour. A standard of care no army had ever managed. Yet the same weather and enemy fire that made the firebase dangerous could keep the dust-offs away, and men died at the wire waiting for a helicopter the monsoon or the ground fire would not permit to land. The system was extraordinary. It was not omnipotent. Underlying all of it was the constant uncertainty, which may have been the hardest thing to carry. The enemy chose when to fight. He might leave a firebase alone for weeks, content to wait, and the waiting itself became a form of pressure. Almost everyone in Vietnam lived with the awareness that an arbitrary death could arrive at any moment, from an ambush, an explosion, or one of the many accidents and cases of so-called collateral damage that struck without warning. In pure statistics, the threat was often more perceived than real, but that hardly mattered to the men who lived it, because the danger was never merely in the background. It sat in the middle ground of the picture, unspecified and ever-present, coloring every quiet hour. They lived permanently on the edge of an event they could not schedule and could not prevent, only survive. That condition, sustained over months, did things to men that no single battle could. The human cost accumulated in ways that did not always show up in casualty figures. Fatigue was the baseline, not the tiredness of a hard day, but a deep structural exhaustion built up over weeks of broken sleep, physical labor, poor food, and constant stress. It slowed men down and made the ordinary tasks of survival harder. And though commanders knew exhausted troops made mistakes, the manpower to relieve them was seldom there. Fear ran alongside the fatigue. Every man understood he might be killed at any moment by an enemy he would probably never see, and the response was not the absence of fear, but its compression into something he could function alongside. Men fell into routines, focused on the immediate task, and let the larger dread recede. The small, controllable acts, keeping a weapon clean and a position squared away, were a way of holding on to some agency in a situation that offered very little. The fear did not go away. It became a kind of weather the men learned to live inside. Boredom, strange as it sounds alongside the danger, was one of the defining features of firebase life. The vast majority of hours were not combat, but waiting, labor, and the grinding repetition of the same tasks in the same heat, with the same faces. Long stretches of tedium, punctuated by moments of extreme violence, proved corrosive, giving men too much time to anticipate the danger before it arrived without warning. Soldiers filled the empty hours with letters home, card games, the endless improvement of their positions, and talk of the world they had left and the day they would return to it. Morale depended on a handful of things, and the calendar was chief among them. The American tour lasted for most soldiers 12 months, and that fixed date shaped everything. Every man knew almost to the day when he was due to go home, and the war was, for the individual soldier, not a cause to be won, but a period to be survived. This set Vietnam apart from earlier American wars, where units deployed and returned together. Here a man might arrive as a stranger and leave while the position and the war continued without him. Against that isolation, the strongest source of resilience was the bond between the men themselves. They did not endure the firebase for abstractions. They endured it for each other, for the men in the next bunker, and that loyalty was the real engine of survival, the thing that got exhausted, frightened men to their positions night after night. Humor, often dark and profane, was another tool. So were the less constructive escapes. Alcohol reached the firebases when supply allowed, and in some units and periods, drug use became a serious problem, a reflection of the strain and of the broader decline in discipline that afflicted parts of the army as the war ground toward its unpopular end. Set against the hardship, these troops enjoyed advantages the enemy did not, and the small comforts became lifelines. Mail from home was the most powerful, the main link to the family a soldier had left, and mail call was almost always the high point of the day. It could also go painfully wrong when a letter carried news of a death, a girlfriend's silence, or trouble he had no way to get home and attend to. Rock and roll records and transistor radios arrived together in the 1960s to make something new possible. Music piped into frontline positions as no earlier war had known, mixed with the ever-present cigarettes. Men in daily fear of a violent death were not much troubled by the distant risk of cancer, and they drew calm from the nicotine, which had the side benefit of suppressing hunger. Faith mattered too. When a chaplain could reach a firebase, he held services in the open field, occasions made all the more powerful by how rare they were. And behind everything stood the medic, the corpsman who lived alongside the platoon and was, by the near-unanimous testimony of the memoirs, devoted to every man and unsparing with the wounded, and behind him the dust-off helicopter, the ultimate reassurance that a wounded man would be lifted out fast and carried back to what the troops called the world. What all of this endurance was for became clear in the moments a firebase was actually attacked. A well-run base could absorb enormous punishment. The interlocking fields of fire from the bunkers, the claymores and trip flares in the wire, and above all the artillery, which could be lowered to fire directly into an attacking force or send a beehive round of thousands of steel darts sweeping across the perimeter, combined into a killing ground that assaulting infantry crossed at terrible cost. When gunships and fixed-wing aircraft could reach the fight, a night assault became a slaughter for the attackers. Yet the margin between domination and disaster could be thin. At Landing Zone Bird in December 1966 in Binh Dinh province, a determined night assault briefly overran part of the perimeter and reached the guns, and the crews survived by firing beehive rounds into the attackers at point-blank range, one of the first significant uses of that ammunition in the war. The firebase could go from overwhelming firepower to a hand-to-hand fight among the gun pits in minutes, and the outcome often came down to the discipline and nerve of individual crews in the first moments. A sustained effort against a base looked different. At Fire Support Base Ripcord in the summer of 1970, in rugged mountains near the Ershau Valley, the 101st Airborne Division came under weeks of continuous mortar and rocket fire. Its resupply helicopters shot down and the surrounding hills filling with enemy troops, until the command judged the position could not be held at acceptable cost and evacuated it under fire. Abandoning a firebase was its own grueling task, because the fortifications had to be dismantled rather than left behind. The fear, entirely justified, was that the enemy would salvage scrap metal and discarded munitions into weapons of his own, and that ready-made bunkers on a commanding site would be devilishly hard to retake. Tearing a position down could be nearly as laborious as building it. Ripcord demonstrated a hard truth. A fixed position could be made too costly to hold if the enemy was willing to commit the resources and absorb the losses, and the firebase gave up the initiative to an enemy who chose whether, when, and how hard to press. These engagements shared a pattern. The enemy achieved surprise and initial penetration through careful reconnaissance and the shock of the opening barrage. The defenders absorbed the blow, held at the core, and ground the assault down through firepower, discipline, and the arrival of air support. Most firebase attacks ended in tactical defeat for the attackers, who paid heavily for the ground they briefly took, and yet the strategic ledger was never as clear as the body counts suggested. Each attack confirmed that the men behind the wire could never truly relax, that the initiative belonged to the other side, and that the whole system of fixed firepower rested on the endurance of soldiers living in conditions that were themselves a form of slow attrition. The firebase could win almost every battle at its wire, and still leave the men who held it worn down, sick, and no closer to an end they could see. By the time the American ground war wound down and the fighting passed to South Vietnamese forces in the early 1970s, thousands of these positions had been built, held, fought over, and abandoned across South Vietnam, most leaving no trace beyond a scar of red earth, soon reclaimed by the jungle. They were a particular answer to an impossible strategic problem. an attempt to impose control on a countryside that would not be controlled. The Firebase never lost its central battle in most cases. It simply could not deliver the larger victory the strategy promised, because the enemy declined to be destroyed and the war declined to end. The soldiers who filled the sandbags, worked the guns, and walked the patrols understood this more intimately than the planners who designed it, because they lived at the exact point where strategy met the ground, and the ground gave nothing away for free. The Firebase endures as one of the defining images of the American war in Vietnam. A raw circle of red dirt, hacked from the jungle or perched on a bare hilltop, its guns pointed outward at an enemy who chose his moments and its men living in a state of exhausted vigilance that had no fixed end. The hardship these positions imposed was not incidental to the strategy. It was the strategy's true cost, paid not in the dramatic battles that reached the newspapers, but in the accumulated weight of heat, disease, fear, and fatigue borne by ordinary soldiers on ground whose names most of the country would never learn. The guns fell silent, the helicopters stopped coming, and the jungle took the clearings back. What remained was carried home by the men who had held them, a war measured not in ground gained, but in days survived.